What happens when an airline captain orders a quiet black father out of seat 8A, only to discover the man has spent more hours flying combat missions than anyone wearing a captain's uniform on that aircraft? The confrontation began less than 10 minutes before departure. The cabin door was still open. Passengers were settling into their seats. Overhead bins slammed shut, one after another. Then the captain stepped out of the cockpit, his face already showing irritation. His eyes locked onto a man sleeping peacefully in seat 8A. Curled against the man's shoulder was a little girl. No older than 9, hugging a faded stuffed rabbit as if the long day at the airport had finally caught up with her. The captain didn't ask a question. He didn't check a passenger list. He didn't speak to the flight attendant who had completed boarding. Instead, his voice echoed through the front half of the cabin. "Sir, wake up!" Marcus slowly opened his eyes. He blinked once, careful not to wake his daughter. "Yes, you're in the wrong seat. Collect your belongings and move." The words spread through the cabin faster than the sound itself. Heads turned, conversation stopped, phones lowered. Marcus glanced calmly at the boarding pass still resting inside his passport. "I believe this is seat 8A. The captain folded his arms. "It isn't. Let's not delay the flight." Marcus didn't argue. He simply looked at the captain and spoke in the same steady voice. "Would you mind checking the passenger manifest first?" For a brief second, the cabin became completely still. The request was reasonable, professional, exactly what airline procedure required. But the captain never reached for the manifest. Instead, his expression hardened. "I've already made my decision." A businessman sitting across the aisle smirked. "I knew something looked off," another passenger quietly whispered. "I don't think he belongs up here." Marcus heard every word. He answered, none of them. His only concern was the little girl still sleeping against his shoulder. Unaware that nearly everyone around her had begun watching her father as if he were the problem delaying the flight. The captain took one step closer. "If you don't move now, airport security will remove you." Not once did Marcus raise his voice. Not once did he lose his temper. He simply placed one hand gently over his daughter's shoulder to keep her asleep. The captain mistook that silence for surrender. It was the biggest mistake he would make that day, because before Flight 728 ever left the ground, the man being ordered out of seat 8A would force everyone on board, including the captain, to question everything they thought they knew about the quiet father sitting beside that little girl. Marcus never looked like the kind of passenger people expected to see near the front of an airplane. His navy jacket had been worn for years, the cuffs softened by time instead of fashion. His carry-on was a faded military green backpack with one broken zipper pull that had been repaired with a simple key ring. The sneakers on his feet were spotless but old enough to tell a story of practicality rather than wealth. Nothing about him suggested privilege. Nothing suggested status, and certainly nothing suggested that he had once been trusted with aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His daughter, Maya, slowly opened her eyes as the cabin settled back into a nervous silence. She rubbed them sleepily before looking up at her father. "Are we flying now?" Marcus smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Not yet, sweetheart." She noticed everyone staring. "Did we do something wrong?" He gently brushed a loose curl away from her face. "No, sometimes people make decisions before they know all the facts." It was an answer he had given many times throughout her childhood. Not because life had been unfair every day, but because Marcus had learned long ago that arguing with assumptions rarely changed them. Facts did. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant named Emily watched the exchange with growing discomfort. She had scanned Marcus's boarding pass herself less than 20 minutes earlier. She distinctly remembered the green confirmation light. Seat 8A, everything had matched. She glanced toward the cabin tablet mounted near the galley. One quick verification would settle the matter. She took a cautious step toward the captain. "Captain Reynolds." He didn't even look at her. "I'm handling it." Emily stopped. She had only been with the airline for 18 months. Captain Reynolds had nearly 3 decades in commercial aviation. No one challenged him in front of passengers. At least no one ever did. Marcus noticed the hesitation in her eyes. He understood exactly what she was thinking. She wanted to do the right thing. She simply wasn't in a position to overrule the person wearing 4 stripes. So Marcus gave her the smallest nod. A silent message. "It's okay. Don't risk your career for me." Emily lowered her eyes, but the uneasy feeling remained. Meanwhile, the businessman across the aisle leaned toward another passenger just loudly enough to be overheard. "I've flown this route for years. They usually catch these seat mistakes before boarding." The other man shrugged. Maybe he just hoped nobody would notice. Several passengers nodded without knowing a single fact. Nobody asked to see a boarding pass. Nobody questioned whether procedure had actually been followed. It was easier to trust confidence than evidence. Marcus had seen that pattern before. Many times, only never at 30,000 feet. Not yet. He rested a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. She reached for his hand without saying a word. The small gesture reminded him why he had accepted this trip in the first place. They weren't traveling for business. They weren't on vacation. They were flying to Colorado Springs to attend the graduation ceremony of Marcus's younger sister, the first person in their family to earn a medical degree. He had promised he would be there. Nothing, not rude passengers, not an impatient captain, not public embarrassment was going to make him break that promise. No one in the cabin could have guessed that the quiet father they were judging had spent 22 years flying combat missions in places most people only saw on the evening news. He had survived missile locks, night operations over hostile territory, emergency landings with crippled aircraft. He had remained calm while lives depended on every decision he made. Compared with those moments, an argument over seat 8A barely registered. What Marcus didn't know was that within the next hour, the captain who believed he was removing an ordinary passenger would desperately wish that very same man had been sitting exactly where he was. Captain Daniel Reynolds had spent nearly 28 years in commercial aviation. His photograph hung on the wall of the Airline's training center. New hires were told stories about his perfect safety record. Passengers often smiled when they saw the silver-haired captain greeting them at the aircraft door. To most people, he represented confidence, authority, experience, and over the years, that reputation had quietly become something else: certainty. Reynolds no longer believed he could be wrong. Inside the cockpit, he made hundreds of decisions every flight. Most of them were good ones, but somewhere along the way, he had begun treating every decision as if it no longer required verification. His word had become enough. That habit had never caused a serious problem until today. As Reynolds stood in the aisle facing Marcus, he barely noticed the passengers watching him. His attention had shifted to another source of irritation. A sharply dressed businessman seated in 8C leaned forward with an impatient sigh. "I have a connection in Dallas," the man complained. "We've already lost enough time."
Reynolds nodded once. "I understand." The businessman glanced toward Marcus.
"I'm not trying to be rude, Captain, but people shouldn't just sit wherever they want." Several nearby passengers quietly murmured in agreement. No one had seen Marcus force his way into the seat. No one had watched him board. No one knew whether his ticket had been checked. Yet a single confident accusation had already become accepted as fact. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She remembered scanning Marcus's boarding pass herself. Everything had matched. She knew it. She reached for the electronic manifest on the cabin tablet. Before she could unlock it, Reynolds noticed. "What are you doing?" I just wanted to verify seat 8A. "Captain, there isn't time. It'll only take a few seconds," I said. No. His tone was calm but final. Emily slowly lowered her hand. The businessman smiled to himself. The captain had chosen a side. Marcus watched the exchange without interrupting. He wasn't studying the captain's face anymore. He was studying something else. The way Reynolds ignored procedure. The way he dismissed his own crew. The way experience had quietly turned into arrogance. Marcus had flown with men like that years ago. Pilots who believed confidence could replace checklists. Some of them had learned the lesson the easy way. Others had learned it after people got hurt. He hoped Captain Reynolds would belong to the first group. The captain looked back toward Marcus. "This is your last opportunity. You can move voluntarily, or airport security will move you."
Maya looked up at her father, confused. "Dad." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay." She trusted him completely. The captain mistook that calm for stubbornness.
"Across the cabin?" Another flight attendant quietly whispered to Emily. "Shouldn't we at least check the manifest?" Emily answered without taking her eyes off Marcus. "We should." Neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to openly challenge a senior captain in front of 87 passengers. The silence gave Reynolds exactly what he expected. Compliance. Except one person still hadn't complied. Marcus. He wasn't refusing. He wasn't arguing. He was simply waiting. Waiting to see whether the captain would remember the first lesson every pilot was ever taught. Never assume. Always verify. Captain Reynolds never asked to see the manifest. Instead, he reached for the interphone and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Send airport security on board." That was the moment a simple seating dispute stopped being about seat 8A. It became a test of judgment, and Captain Reynolds had just failed the first one. The cabin door remained open. Outside, the steady hum of ground equipment drifted through the jet bridge. Inside, the silence had become almost unbearable. Captain Reynolds lowered the interphone. "They'll be here in a moment." His voice carried through the cabin as though the matter had already been settled. Marcus looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "Captain, I'm asking one final time. Would you please verify the passenger manifest?" "It would take less than 30 seconds. Reynolds shook his head. "My responsibility is getting this aircraft out on time. My responsibility," Marcus replied calmly, "is making sure my daughter stays where she's supposed to be." The captain's expression hardened. "Your responsibility is following crew instructions." Marcus nodded slowly. "I always do when those instructions follow procedure." Several passengers exchanged nervous glances. No one expected the conversation to stay this calm. No shouting, no insults. No dramatic confrontation, just one quiet man asking for the same thing over and over. "Please verify the manifest." Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. "Captain," she held up the cabin tablet. "The seat map is already open. It'll only take a few seconds. Reynolds didn't even look at the screen. I've already made my decision." Emily hesitated. "But if the manifest," I said, "enough." The sharpness in his voice echoed across the first few rows. Emily lowered the tablet. Not because she believed he was right, because she knew arguing further would only make matters worse. Marcus noticed. So did half the cabin. Everyone had just watched procedure lose to pride. Across the aisle, the businessman folded his arms with obvious satisfaction. This shouldn't be difficult. He muttered. "If he has the wrong seat, he moves." Another passenger nodded. "They've probably seen this before." Neither of them had. Marcus reached into the seat pocket and carefully removed the boarding pass that had been tucked inside his passport. Without standing, he extended it toward the captain. "My boarding pass, would you like to see it?" Reynolds didn't take it. "I don't need to." Marcus kept holding it out. "It has my seat assignment." I said, "I don't need to." For the first time, a ripple of uncertainty spread through the surrounding rows. Passengers weren't questioning Marcus anymore. They were beginning to question why the captain refused to look at the evidence sitting less than 2 feet away. Maya tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Dad, are they making us leave?" Marcus turned toward her with the same reassuring smile she'd known her entire life. "Not unless we're supposed to, but if we are, then we'll leave with respect." She nodded, trusting every word. The businessman rolled his eyes.
See? He's stalling.
Captain Reynolds glanced toward the cockpit clock. Every passing second felt like another challenge to his authority. He stepped closer until he was standing directly beside seat 8A. "I'm removing you from this aircraft." Marcus looked up at him for refusing to surrender a seat or for asking you to verify the manifest. The question hung in the air. No one answered. Because everyone knew there was only one correct response, and it wasn't the one the captain wanted to give. Just then, footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. Heavy, measured. Airport security had arrived. Captain Reynolds let out a slow breath, convinced the situation was finally under control. He couldn't have known those footsteps were about to turn a routine abuse of authority into the most embarrassing moment of his entire career. The 2 airport security officers stepped into the aircraft expecting another routine boarding dispute. They had handled dozens that month alone. Passengers refusing to check oversized bags. Arguments over overhead bin space. People trying to board after the gate had closed. This looked no different, at least at first. Captain Reynolds walked toward them before either officer could speak. "This passenger refuses to follow crew instructions." He pointed directly at Marcus. "I've ordered him to leave the aircraft several times." The older security officer, Sergeant Collins, gave a short nod. He had learned long ago that most passenger removals began with listening before acting. He approached seat 8A slowly. "Good afternoon, sir." Marcus looked up. "Good afternoon, officer. My name is Sergeant Collins. Would you mind telling me what's happening from your perspective?" Marcus answered without emotion. "I was instructed to leave my assigned seat. I asked the captain to verify the passenger manifest before asking me to move. I've made the same request 3 times. Has the manifest been checked?" Collins looked toward Captain Reynolds. "No!" The answer came from Emily before the captain could speak. Every head in the cabin turned toward her. Emily swallowed hard but continued. "It hasn't been verified." Captain Reynolds shot her a cold look. "Emily, that's enough!" But the words were already out. The younger security officer frowned. "You haven't confirmed the seat assignment?" Captain Reynolds folded his arms. "I don't need to. The passenger is delaying departure." Marcus calmly held out his boarding pass once again. "I've offered this several times. This is my assigned seat." Collins accepted it immediately. It took him less than 2 seconds to read it. Seat 8A, flight 728. Everything appeared normal. He looked back at the captain. "May I compare this with the manifest?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I've already handled it." Collins didn't move. "Respectfully, Captain, I'd still like to verify. For the first time since leaving the cockpit, Reynolds found himself being questioned. Not by a passenger, not by a junior flight attendant, but by airport security." His patience disappeared. "Officer, are you refusing a captain's instruction?" The question caught everyone off guard. Collins answered carefully. "I'm following airport procedure. If we're removing someone, we verify the facts first." The businessman in seat 8C threw up his hands. "This is ridiculous. We're going to miss our connections because one passenger won't cooperate." Marcus turned toward him for the first time. His voice remained calm. "I've cooperated with every lawful request. I've simply asked for the same courtesy in return." No one had an answer to that. Not the businessman, not the captain, not the passengers who had quietly judged him only minutes earlier. Emily gathered enough courage to speak again. "The electronic manifest is already open. It's right here." She raised the cabin tablet one more time. The screen glowed in her hands. One touch, one passenger name, less than 10 seconds. That was all it would take to end the dispute. Captain Reynolds never looked. Instead, he made a decision that stunned even his own crew. "Escort him off the aircraft." The words landed like a weight across the cabin. Maya's fingers tightened around her father's hand. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, why won't they believe you?" Marcus looked into his daughter's frightened eyes. Then he smiled with the same quiet confidence she had always known. Because sometimes, people become so certain they're right that they stop looking for the truth. Sergeant Collins remained exactly where he was. He didn't touch Marcus. He didn't reach for his arm. Instead, he looked directly at Captain Reynolds. "Captain, if this passenger leaves this aircraft, I want it clearly stated that you're ordering his removal before verifying the manifest." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the businessman stopped talking. Captain Reynolds had expected unquestioned support. Instead, every person around him was now waiting for his answer. He took a slow breath, then he doubled down. "That's exactly what I'm ordering. No one on board realized it yet." But with those 7 words, Captain Reynolds had just created a decision that would soon be reviewed far beyond the walls of this aircraft, and before the next announcement came over the intercom. The flight itself would become the least of his concerns. Captain Reynolds' words hung in the cabin like a warning light that refused to turn off. That's exactly what I'm ordering. No one spoke. Sergeant Collins didn't move. Neither did Marcus. For several long seconds, the aircraft seemed frozen in place. Then a sharp chime broke the silence. The interphone rang inside the cockpit. Reynolds muttered under his breath before turning away to answer it. "This is Captain Reynolds!" His expression changed almost immediately. "Copy that. How severe!" He listened without saying another word. When he returned to the cabin, the confidence on his face had faded ever so slightly. Emily noticed it first. Something had changed. The captain looked toward his first officer. "Dispatch just updated the weather." She nodded. "I saw the alert. A line of fast-moving thunderstorms had intensified across the planned route. Several aircraft had already diverted. Another airport farther south was reporting dangerous crosswinds. The dispatcher wanted every crew to review alternate approaches before departure. The situation wasn't yet an emergency, but it was no longer routine. Passengers sensed the shift. The businessman who had been complaining leaned toward the window. "What's going on?" No one answered. Inside the cockpit, the first officer studied the updated weather radar. Red cells spread across the screen, not isolated. A solid wall. She quietly spoke to the captain. "If those cells keep moving east, we'll probably need another diversion plan." Reynolds nodded.
I know, she hesitated. There may be another option.
He looked at her. The dispatcher also asked if we had anyone on board with recent military heavy weather experience. Reynolds frowned. "What? They're gathering information. Some retired military pilots are traveling today because of the Veterans Aviation Conference, if one happens to be on board. Dispatch wants to know." The captain let out a short laugh. "We don't need help flying this airplane." "No, sir, but that's what they requested." Reynolds looked annoyed. Another interruption. Another delay. Another distraction from removing the passenger in seat 8A. He grabbed the PA handset anyway. His voice echoed throughout the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to changing weather conditions, dispatch has asked us to make a routine inquiry. If there are any current or former military combat pilots on board, please identify yourselves to a member of the cabin crew after boarding is complete." The announcement ended. Silence followed. Passengers looked around. A few smiled. One teenager whispered, "That sounds pretty serious." Across the aisle, the businessman chuckled. "Guess we're waiting on a war hero now." A few people laughed quietly. Marcus didn't. He simply looked out the window. His daughter tilted her head. "Dad, weren't you a pilot?" Marcus looked down at her with a gentle smile. "A long time ago. Should you tell them?" He glanced toward Captain Reynolds. The captain was still arguing with Sergeant Collins instead of reviewing the manifest. Marcus slowly shook his head. "They're not looking for me," Maya frowned. "But you can help." "I can." He squeezed her small hand. "But helping someone begins with them wanting the truth." Across the cabin, Emily overheard the conversation. She looked at Marcus, then at the captain, then back toward the weather display visible through the open cockpit door. An uneasy feeling settled over her. She couldn't explain why. Only that the quiet man everyone wanted removed seemed strangely unconcerned by the worsening weather, almost as if he had seen conditions far worse. Sergeant Collins noticed it too. Most passengers facing removal became angry, defensive, fearful. Marcus remained remarkably composed, not because he believed he would win the argument, but because none of this was the hardest situation he had ever faced inside an aircraft. The dispatcher called again. This time the first officer answered. Everyone close enough to the cockpit heard only one sentence. "Wait, are you serious?" She slowly turned toward the cabin. Her eyes stopped on seat 8A, then back to the captain. "Captain, you may want to know who that passenger really is." Reynolds barely looked up. "It can wait." The first officer didn't respond. For the first time that afternoon, she wasn't sure the captain understood just how close he was to making the biggest mistake of his career. The weather was changing. The flight was already delayed. But neither of those would become the story people remembered, because within the next few minutes, the quiet father in seat 8A would reveal a past that would leave the entire cockpit speechless. Captain Reynolds was about to dismiss the first officer again when she stepped directly into his path. "Captain, I think you need to see this." There was something different in her voice.
Not fear.
Urgency. She held the operations tablet in both hands. A new message from dispatch had just appeared. Passenger possibly matches retired USAF combat aviator database. Verify identity. Reynolds frowned. "What database?" "The veterans attending today's Aviation Leadership Conference. They cross-checked the passenger list after your announcement." "It's probably a coincidence." He barely glanced at the screen. "Forget it." The first officer didn't lower the tablet. The name matches, the age matches, and the military record. She stopped speaking for a moment.
Doesn't look ordinary.
Captain Reynolds sighed. Fine. He walked toward seat 8A, more irritated than curious. Marcus looked up before the captain said a word. "Has someone finally checked the manifest?"
Reynolds ignored the question. "Were you ever a military pilot?" Marcus answered honestly.
"Yes. When I retired 12 years ago, what did you fly?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "Mostly fighters." The businessman across the aisle laughed. "Everybody's a fighter pilot once security shows up." A few passengers smiled. Marcus didn't react. The captain folded his arms. "If that's true, do you have any identification?" Marcus reached into the worn backpack resting beneath the seat. There were no dramatic movements, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply removed a weathered leather wallet. Inside was an old military identification card. Its edges were faded, the photograph was younger, but the eyes were unmistakably the same. Marcus handed it to the captain. Reynolds examined it for only a second before passing it to the first officer. She scanned the identification into the airline verification system. Everyone waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, then the tablet chimed. A green confirmation banner appeared across the screen. Identity verified. Another notification immediately followed. The first officer's eyes widened. She scrolled, then scrolled again. She whispered almost to herself, "Oh my God!" Captain Reynolds reached for the tablet. "What is it?" She slowly turned the screen toward him. The military service record filled the display. Mission after mission, year after year. Combat deployment spanning 2 decades. Advanced instructor certification. Emergency recovery specialist. Decorated Air Force veteran. Then Reynolds saw the number that made him stop breathing for a moment. Combat flight hours. 2,843. His eyes moved lower. Total military flight hours. 6,917. He looked back toward the cockpit. His own career logbook contained barely half that amount. The first officer quietly broke the silence. "Captain, he has more verified combat hours than every pilot assigned to today's flight." No one spoke. Even the businessman who had mocked Marcus moments earlier stared at the screen without blinking. Emily covered her mouth. She suddenly understood why the quiet father had never argued. He had never needed to. Marcus remained seated. His daughter looked between the adults, confused by the sudden silence. "Dad, did something happen?" He smiled gently. They finally looked. Those 3 words hit harder than any accusation because they were true. Not once had Marcus claimed to be important. Not once had he mentioned his military career. Not once had he tried to use his past to gain special treatment. All he had asked for was for someone to follow procedure. Captain Reynolds slowly lowered the tablet. His face had lost every trace of authority it carried only minutes before. For the first time that afternoon, he wasn't looking at Marcus as a passenger. He was looking at him as a pilot, and in that moment, he realized the quiet father he had tried to remove from seat 8A had already flown through situations far more dangerous than anything Captain Reynolds had ever experienced. The cabin remained completely silent. But the revelation wasn't the real punishment. It was only the beginning. For several seconds, no one in the cabin moved. Captain Reynolds remained frozen, the tablet still in his hands. The military record was undeniable. Every certification had been verified. Every combat deployment confirmed. Everything Marcus had quietly kept to himself was now displayed in black and white. Yet the silence didn't last long. The interphone rang again. This time it rang twice. Sharp, urgent. The first officer answered immediately. "Flight 728, she listened. Her expression changed. She looked toward the weather radar, then toward Captain Reynolds. "They've closed our primary arrival route. The storm line expanded faster than expected." Dispatch continued, speaking through her headset. She nodded several times. "I understand." When she hung up, she took a slow breath. "We've lost our first diversion airport." Captain Reynolds looked at the radar display. Almost every safe corridor had disappeared. Aircraft ahead of them were already requesting alternate routing. Some had entered holding patterns. Others were diverting hundreds of miles away. Ground delays were increasing by the minute. The dispatcher called once more. This time the message was direct. If Mr. Marcus Carter is willing, operations would appreciate his assessment before departure. The captain stared at the radio. He wasn't used to hearing dispatch ask for advice from a passenger, especially one he had tried to remove only moments earlier. Emily quietly stepped beside Marcus.
"Sir."
She hesitated. "Dispatch is asking if you'd be willing to speak with the flight crew." Marcus looked up. "Is there a safety concern? We're evaluating several weather scenarios." Marcus glanced toward Maya. She smiled. "You should help." He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "I'll only be gone a few minutes." She nodded confidently. "I'll be right here." Emily remained beside Maya while Marcus stood for the first time since boarding. The cabin instinctively made room for him, not because anyone asked them to, because everything had changed. Only minutes ago, they had watched a man being treated like he didn't belong. Now every eye followed him with quiet respect. Captain Reynolds waited outside the cockpit. For several awkward seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, the captain broke the silence. "Mr. Carter." Marcus looked at him. "My name is Marcus." The correction wasn't rude. It was gentle, almost effortless. The captain swallowed. "Marcus, I owe you an apology." Marcus shook his head slightly. "We can discuss that later. Right now, your passengers need your attention." Those words struck Reynolds harder than any accusation could have, even after everything that had happened. Marcus was thinking about the people on board, not himself. The first officer invited Marcus into the cockpit. Weather radar painted the display in shades of yellow, red, and deep crimson. The route looked nothing like the briefing they had reviewed before boarding. Marcus studied the screen quietly. He didn't touch a single control. He didn't sit in either pilot's seat. He simply observed. Years of combat flying had taught him never to rush a decision. After nearly a minute, he pointed toward a narrow opening between 2 developing storm cells. "How recent is this radar?" "Less than 2 minutes old," the first officer answered. Marcus nodded. "The southern route will close. It already has. The northern route will stay open a little longer." Captain Reynolds looked surprised. "What makes you think that?" Marcus pointed toward the movement of the storm line. "See the leading edge? The cells are building east, not north." If you depart within the next 15 minutes, ATC can vector you around this section before it closes. The first officer quickly compared his observation with the latest weather model. Her eyes widened. He's right, the updated projection just came in. It matched Marcus's recommendation almost perfectly. Captain Reynolds remained silent, not because he doubted Marcus anymore. Because he suddenly realized something deeply uncomfortable. The man he'd accused of delaying the flight had just identified the safest departure strategy faster than anyone in the cockpit. Marcus stepped back from the display. I've said everything I can. You know your aircraft. You know your procedures. The decision is yours.
He turned toward the cockpit door. Captain Reynolds stopped him.
Marcus, the former combat pilot, paused. I should have listened the first time you asked me to check the manifest. Marcus gave a small smile. Aviation has always worked best when people verify before they decide. Then he walked back into the cabin. No applause followed. No dramatic celebration. Just 87 passengers watching a quiet father return to seat 8A with the same calm dignity he had carried from the very beginning. But Captain Reynolds knew the hardest part was still ahead. Helping Marcus had solved the weather problem. It had not erased the mistake that everyone on board had witnessed. And before Flight 728 reached its destination, that mistake would have to be answered, for the cabin felt different now. No one whispered anymore. No one questioned whether Marcus belonged in seat 8A. The only question left was what Captain Reynolds would do next. He remained standing just outside the cockpit for several long moments. The weather briefing was complete. The revised departure route had been approved by dispatch. Everything was ready. Except one thing. He turned toward the cabin microphone. His hand stopped halfway. For nearly 30 years, he had made thousands of announcements, departure times, weather updates. Delays, safety briefings. Never once had he needed to admit that he had been wrong. The first officer quietly stood beside him. You can still do the right thing. Reynolds looked at her. Then slowly picked up the PA handset. The familiar chime echoed through the aircraft. Every passenger looked toward the front. Ladies and gentlemen. His voice sounded different now. Quieter. I need to make a personal statement before we depart. The cabin became completely
silent.
Earlier today, I made a decision without verifying the facts. I asked a passenger to leave his assigned seat before confirming the passenger manifest. That decision was mine. It did not reflect the standards this airline expects from its crews. He paused, then looked directly towards seat 8A. Mr. Marcus Carter, I owe you a sincere apology. I failed to follow the very procedures I ask others to respect. I judged the situation before checking the evidence, and for that I am deeply sorry. Not a single sound came from the cabin. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Emily quietly wiped away a tear. The apology wasn't forced. It wasn't written by corporate headquarters. It came from the captain himself. Marcus slowly stood. Every eye followed him. He looked toward Captain Reynolds with the same calm expression he had worn since boarding Captain. I accept your apology. A visible wave of relief crossed the captain's face. But, Marcus continued, I hope this isn't the last time someone asks to see the facts before they're asked to leave. The words landed softly, yet they carried more weight than any angry speech could have. Captain Reynolds nodded. It won't happen again. Marcus smiled. I hope not. Without another word, he sat back down beside Maya. His daughter looked up at him. Does that mean everything's okay now? Marcus squeezed her hand. It means someone had the courage to admit a mistake. She smiled. My teacher says that's harder than being right. Marcus laughed quietly. Your teacher is very wise. Across the aisle, the businessman who had started the accusation slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He walked over to Marcus. For a moment, it seemed he couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke. I owe you an apology, too. I judged you without knowing anything about you. Marcus looked at him. We all make quick judgments. The important part is what we do after we realize we're wrong. The businessman extended his hand. Marcus accepted it. No bitterness, no victory, just respect. As the man returned to his seat, several passengers began to clap. The applause started with one elderly woman near the window. Then another passenger joined. Within seconds, the entire cabin was applauding. Not because Marcus had been a combat pilot, not because he had helped solve a weather problem, but because he had shown every person on board what real character looked like. He had remained calm when others became emotional. He had trusted the truth instead of his temper. And in the end, that truth spoke louder than any rank, uniform, or title ever could. As the applause faded, Captain Reynolds closed the cockpit door for the first time that day. Flight 728 was finally ready for departure, but while the aircraft would soon leave the ground, the consequences of what had happened inside that cabin were only beginning. Flight 728 landed safely in Dallas just after sunset. The approach had been smooth. The landing was uneventful. By the time the aircraft reached the gate, most passengers had already convinced themselves the story was over. They were wrong. As soon as the parking brake was set, Captain Reynolds looked at the first officer. I'll be filing an irregular operations report. She nodded. I think that's the right decision. Before anyone opened the cabin door, her company tablet vibrated. A new message from Airline Operations appeared across the screen. Do not release flight crew. Corporate Flight Operations requests immediate debrief. She looked up.
Captain, I think headquarters already knows.
Reynolds frowned. How? Emily quietly answered from the galley. At least 6 passengers recorded what happened, and Sergeant Collins filed his incident report before we pushed back. The captain closed his eyes for a moment. There was no point pretending this would disappear. Everything had been documented. Every instruction, every refusal to verify the manifest. Every witness. Minutes later, 2 senior operations managers boarded the aircraft before any passengers were allowed to leave. One introduced himself. Captain Reynolds, I'm David Foster from Flight Operations. The director would like to speak with you immediately after deplaning. The captain gave a slow nod.
I understand.
The manager turned toward Marcus. Mr. Carter?
Marcus does.
Yes? The manager extended his hand on behalf of the airline. I want to apologize for what happened today. Our preliminary review shows you were correctly assigned to seat 8A before boarding even began. Marcus shook his hand politely. I appreciate that, the manager continued. We've also confirmed that multiple crew members requested the manifest be checked. They were overruled. Emily lowered her eyes. She hadn't expected anyone to mention that. David looked toward her.
Miss Parker.
She looked surprised. Yes, sir? The first officer informed us you attempted to verify the seating assignment several times. Thank you for following company procedure. Emily blinked. I was only doing my job, and that's exactly why we're thanking you. Captain Reynolds listened quietly. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. The issue was no longer about weather or Marcus's military record. It had become something much larger, a failure of judgment, one that had ignored the very safety culture professional aviation depended upon. As passengers slowly began leaving the aircraft, many stopped beside Marcus. An elderly veteran saluted him. Marcus returned the gesture with a respectful nod. A young mother quietly thanked him for staying calm in front of his daughter. Another passenger admitted, I almost believed the captain. Marcus simply smiled. I'm glad you waited long enough to see the whole story. When the cabin had nearly emptied, Sergeant Collins stepped back on board. He carried a small folder, Captain. Reynolds looked up. This contains my incident statement. I documented that I recommended verifying the manifest before removing the passenger. The captain accepted the folder without opening it. I know. Collins hesitated before speaking again. I've been in airport security for 23 years. I've removed people from airplanes. I've arrested people, but today wasn't about a difficult passenger. It was about skipping the simplest step, looking at the facts. Reynolds slowly nodded. I know. Collins left without another word. The empty cabin suddenly felt much quieter than it had all afternoon. The first officer gathered her flight bag. Before leaving, she paused beside the captain. Can I say something? He gave a tired smile. You probably should. She looked towards seat 8A. The mistake wasn't asking someone to move. It was deciding he didn't deserve to be heard. Then she walked off the aircraft. Captain Reynolds remained alone in the cabin for another minute. His eyes settled on the empty seat where Marcus had spent the flight. One seat, one passenger, one decision. That was all it had taken to place nearly 3 decades of reputation under review. But the airline's investigation was only the beginning. By the following morning, someone much higher inside the company would be reading every report connected to Flight 728, and that review would determine far more than the captain's future. The formal investigation continued for weeks. Operations reviewed the cockpit voice recordings, security reports, passenger statements, cabin crew interviews, and every available piece of video recorded inside the aircraft. The conclusion was remarkably consistent. Marcus Carter had remained calm from beginning to end. He had never refused a lawful instruction. He had never raised his voice. He had never attempted to use his military background to influence anyone. Instead, he had asked for one simple thing. Please verify the manifest. Meanwhile, another name kept appearing throughout the investigation. Emily Parker. The young flight attendant who had quietly insisted on checking the passenger list before anyone was removed. She hadn't argued. She hadn't embarrassed her captain. She had simply tried to follow procedure. 3 weeks later, Emily received an unexpected email asking her to report to Airline Operations headquarters. She assumed the investigation still wasn't over instead. She found herself standing inside a conference room overlooking the maintenance hangars. The vice president of flight operations stood as she entered. Emily, please have a seat. She did, unsure what to expect. The executive smiled. You've probably been wondering why you're here. Emily nodded. A little, he slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the investigation's final report. One paragraph had been highlighted. Flight attendant Emily Parker repeatedly attempted to verify the passenger manifest and encouraged adherents to establish safety procedures despite direct pressure to abandon them. Her conduct reflected the airline's highest professional standards. Emily looked up. I was just trying to do my job. The executive smiled. That's exactly why you're sitting here. He opened another folder. We're promoting you into our crew resource management instructor program. Emily blinked. I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you correctly. You did. We need instructors who understand that professionalism isn't about rank. It's about having the courage to protect procedure, even when it's uncomfortable. Emily sat speechless. She had joined the airline less than 2 years earlier. She never imagined that simply doing the right thing would change her career. Across town, Marcus was preparing to fly home with Maya. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar corporate number. This is Marcus, Mr. Carter. This is David Foster from Flight Operations. I wanted you to know the investigation has been completed. Marcus listened quietly. We've updated our recurrent training. Your case will now be used without identifying you as a real example of why verification must always come before assumption. Marcus smiled. I'm glad something good came from it. There is one more thing, the young flight attendant, Emily Parker. She has been selected to help train future cabin crews. Marcus looked out the terminal window where aircraft taxied beneath the afternoon sun. She earned it. She never stopped trying to do the right thing. After ending the call, Maya looked up from her coloring book. Was that the airline? Marcus nodded. They wanted to tell me someone got rewarded. The lady who was nice to us? Yes, Maya smiled.
I knew she was a good person.
Marcus chuckled softly. Sometimes the people who make the biggest difference aren't the loudest. They're the ones who quietly choose what's right. Several months later, new flight attendants attending their first week of training watched a classroom presentation titled, Verify Before You Decide. The instructor standing at the front of the room was Emily. She never mentioned Marcus by name. She never mentioned combat hours. She never spoke about the media attention the incident had received. Instead, she held up a mock boarding pass and asked one simple question. What is the fastest way to lose a passenger's trust? The room remained silent. Emily answered it herself. Assume. She held up the electronic passenger manifest. And what's the fastest way to earn it back? A small smile crossed her face. Verify first. Hundreds of future flight attendants would remember that lesson. Not because it came from a policy manual, but because one quiet father in seat 8A had refused to let procedure become optional. The following morning, the airport felt nothing like it had the day before. There were no raised voices, no crowd watching, no captain standing over seat 8A, just the quiet rhythm of travelers beginning another day. Marcus and Maya walked side by side through the terminal, each carrying a small backpack. For the first time in days, neither of them was in a hurry. Maya skipped ahead for a few steps before stopping in front of a large window overlooking the runway. A wide-body aircraft slowly pushed back from its gate. She watched it disappear toward the taxiway. Dad? Marcus smiled.
Yeah?
She looked out at the airplane for another moment. Do you ever miss flying? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rested one hand against the glass. I miss the people, the mission, the responsibility, but not the danger. Maya nodded thoughtfully. I think the airplanes miss you. Marcus laughed softly. You think so? She shrugged. They seemed happier when you talked about them. He smiled. Maybe they resumed walking. A few passengers recognized Marcus from Flight 728. One elderly couple stopped to thank him again. Another man simply nodded with quiet respect as they passed. Marcus returned every greeting the same way, with humility, no stories. No mention of combat missions, no reminders of what had happened to him. Yesterday was already over. Near their departure gate, Maya tugged gently on his sleeve. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. She looked up with a kind of curiosity only children have when the captain was being unfair. Why didn't you tell everyone you were a combat pilot? Marcus looked at her for several seconds before answering. Because if someone only treats you with respect after they learn your title, then they never really respected you. She thought about that quietly. So you wanted them to choose kindness first? Marcus smiled. I wanted them to choose facts first. Kindness usually follows. They found 2 empty seats overlooking the runway. For a while, neither of them spoke. Aircraft lifted into the bright morning sky one after another. Each departure reminded Marcus of another chapter of his life. One that had shaped him but no longer defined him. His phone vibrated. A message from his younger sister appeared. Thank you for coming. Seeing you and Maya here meant everything.
Love you, big brother.
Marcus smiled and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Maya leaned against his shoulder. I'm glad we came.
So am I?
A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Their flight home was ready. As they walked down the jet bridge, a gate agent scanned their boarding passes. The scanner flashed green. She smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. Marcus smiled back. Thank you. No questions, no assumptions, no unnecessary attention, just professionalism. Exactly the way air travel was meant to be. As Marcus and Maya reached their row, Maya looked around the cabin before whispering with a grin. Good news! Marcus raised an eyebrow. What? Our seats are really ours this time. He laughed, a full, genuine laugh she hadn't heard in days. They always were. Father and daughter settled into their seats. Outside, the morning sun reflected across the wing. The cabin door closed. The engine slowly came to life. This time, the journey began exactly as it should have, with dignity, with respect, and with the quiet confidence that the truth never needs to shout to be heard. Some stories are remembered because of dramatic endings. Others are remembered because they quietly changed the people who witnessed them. Flight 728 became one of those stories. Not because of severe weather, not because a retired combat pilot happened to be on board, and not because a captain admitted he was wrong. People remembered it because one simple choice separated professionalism from prejudice. A boarding pass could have settled everything in seconds. A quick glance at the passenger manifest would have prevented an entire chain of embarrassment. Instead, assumptions were allowed to replace facts. And assumptions almost became the airline's greatest mistake that day. Marcus never wanted to embarrass anyone. He never wanted applause. He never wanted recognition for the thousands of hours he had spent flying missions that most people could never imagine. His greatest victory wasn't proving that he had been right. It was proving that dignity doesn't need to compete with arrogance. Real strength rarely raises its voice, it waits, it stays disciplined, and it trusts that the truth will eventually speak for itself. Captain Reynolds also learned something that every aviation professional should remember. Experience is valuable, but experience becomes dangerous the moment it convinces someone they no longer need to verify. Every checklist exists for a reason. Every procedure exists because someone, somewhere, once paid a heavy price for skipping it. The smallest shortcut can become the biggest failure. Emily discovered another lesson. Doing the right thing isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it means standing alone. Sometimes it means questioning someone with more authority than you. Not with disrespect, but with professionalism, because real leadership isn't measured by the stripes on a uniform. It's measured by the courage to protect the truth when it's easiest to stay silent. And Maya carried home perhaps the most important lesson of all. She watched her father respond to humiliation without hatred. She watched him answer disrespect with patience. She watched him accept an apology without seeking revenge. Years later, she might not remember every word spoken inside that airplane, but she would always remember how her father made her feel safe, even when the adults around him had failed to do the right thing. Respect should never depend on appearance. Kindness should never depend on someone's title. And justice begins the moment we choose evidence over assumption, because the next quiet stranger you overlook may be carrying a lifetime of experience you'll never see until you take the time to look. As Flight 728 disappeared into the evening sky, life moved on for everyone who had been on board. Passengers caught their connections. The crew prepared for new assignments. The airport welcomed another wave of travelers. But for those who witnessed what happened in seat 8A, something had changed. They had been reminded that the strongest people are often the quietest, that true authority never has to announce itself, and that the greatest act of professionalism is sometimes as simple as taking a few seconds to verify the facts before judging another human being. Marcus Carter never asked anyone to remember his name. He never expected applause. He simply asked for the same fairness every passenger deserves. Perhaps that's why his story continues to resonate. Not because he was a decorated combat pilot, but because he proved that character is revealed long before credentials are. So the next time you meet someone whose story you don't know, take a moment. Ask before you assume. Listen before you judge. Because behind an ordinary face may be an extraordinary life. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you had been sitting on Flight 728 that day? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? If you believe respect should never depend on appearance, and that truth deserves a chance to be heard, please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story where dignity, courage, and justice rise above prejudice. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.